It's This Week in Utah Politics for Friday, July 26, 2024. Joe Biden steps down, Kamala Harris steps up. Utah Republicans are upset about how this all went down. We'll hear from a Utah Democrat who's been a longtime ally of President Biden about what happened and what's next. Salt Lake County District Attorney Gill, a Democrat, is facing backlash from legislative Republicans after a social media post criticizing Donald Trump. Whoops, Senator Mike Lee falls for a hoax about former President Jimmy Carter, and Governor Spencer Cox says he endorsed Donald Trump because he was committed to lowering the temperature of our political rhetoric. A week later, that's not going so well. I'm Brian Schott, political correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune, and welcome to This Week in Utah Politics. In just a moment, we'll talk with my colleague, Emily Anderson-Stern, about the important Utah political news stories from the past week. A little bit later on the show, I'll be joined by former Senate Minority Leader Scott Howell, a longtime ally of President Joe Biden, and we'll talk about his reaction to the news that President Biden has withdrawn from the presidential race. Howell has also gotten to know Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the presumptive Democratic nominee. That started when she came to Salt Lake City for the vice presidential debate at the University of Utah in 2020. We'll hear some stories about that. But before we get to all of that, remember to like and subscribe to the show. Also, leave us a rating and review, which helps new people find the podcast. And if you have a question or a comment for the program, you can just leave it on our voicemail. Give us a call at 385-236-3205. That number again is 385-236-3205, and I might just use your message in a future episode of the show. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let's dig into the news of the week. Joining me now on the show is my colleague from the Salt Lake Tribune politics team, Emily Anderson-Stern. Emily, great to see you. How have you been this?
Great. Just trying to keep up with the roller coaster that is American and Utah politics nowadays.
There's that misattributed quote to Lenin that some decades nothing happens and some weeks decades happen, or something along those lines. Anyway, this has been one of those weeks as we are barreling towards the 2024 election, and the big news happened on Sunday that President Joe Biden announced he was not going to run for another term in office. Kamala Harris is now the presumptive Democratic nominee. This seems to have caught Donald Trump and his supporters, especially here in the Beehive State, off guard. They were pushing for Biden to drop out of the race, but it feels like they weren't exactly expecting that to happen. What has been the reaction that you've gauged from the Republicans here in the state? I know that Mike Lee has been yelling about how the Democrats are subverting democracy by going against the wishes of the primary voters. But, there's no law that says Joe Biden has to run for another term.
Right. And, you've seen a lot of that, I think, a lot among the further right folks in the Republican Party here in the state. A lot of saying, essentially that this move is cheating from the Republican Party, and that, even Mike Lee has floated essentially conspiracies that this was the plan all along, that, Kamala Harris just wanted to circumvent a primary election without proof, of course. And, that's something that a lot of the people who likely are his supporters in the Republican Party have echoed. But then you see other folks in the Republican Party who maybe are considered some of the more moderate elected officials in the party here in the state, like Governor Spencer Cox and his predecessor, Governor Gary Herbert, who mainly focused their message on thanking President Biden for his years of public service.
Yeah, and speaking of Senator Mike Lee, he's also been talking about how they need to invoke the 25th Amendment. If Biden can't run for another term, he can't remain in office, which is not how this works. It's not how any of this works. And a lot of this just really feels like bad faith arguments done for the sake of politics, which is pretty much the world that we live in right now. You noted that Representative Burgess Owens, who's one of 4 black Republicans in Congress, he came out, and this was right before congressional leaders told members of their caucus, the Republican caucus in the House, to stop calling Kamala Harris a DEI hire. He came out and said that she was the greatest example of DEI, which is kind of an interesting take, especially coming from Representative Owens, who is, like I said, is just one of 4 Black Republicans in the House of Representatives.
Right. And he told Punchbowl News that. And, I will say, Kamala Harris, it's a pretty interesting argument to make. And it seems like, if you're following some of these spaces on social media, that more and more people have echoed those kinds of quotes after he and other members of Congress said that. But Kamala Harris has been a public servant for a long time. Before this, before being vice president, she was a U.S. senator. She was the Attorney General of California. She was a district attorney. She goes a long way back. And it's, honestly, she has a longer resume than a lot of people who've been elected to positions in the nation's capital.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially Burgess Owens, who, if you look at his resume and putting them up together, he was a football player and then a failed businessman with a number of businesses that went bankrupt. He ran a charity, and we've ran a number of stories on this about we're not really sure what this charity does or where the money's been going. And then he, without any real connections to the state, got elected to Congress. So, it's an interesting contrast, and we'll have to watch as this goes along. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the decision by Biden to step down and Kamala Harris to step up with former state Senator Scott Howell, who's been a longtime ally of President Biden, and also has gotten to know Vice President Harris. That'll be a little bit later on the podcast, so stay tuned for that. And you also talked about you wrote a story early this week about the process that Utah Democrats will have to go through to get a new candidate on the ballot, which, they have until the end of August in order to get someone new on the ballot. There's really no one on the ballot yet. So they have until the end of August to name their presidential and vice presidential nominees.
Right. And the process is really quite simple in Utah. And it's interesting. So essentially the process is just that the national party offices have to submit a nominee that they sign off on to the lieutenant governor's office before 5 p.m. on August 31st. And, they will have long finished their convention by then in Chicago, in which Utah will have 34 delegates from the Utah Democratic Party voting for the presidential ticket. It's interesting that the process really is so simple, because you have seen some folks here spreading misinformation around whether or not, or how difficult it might be for Democrats to get someone on the ballot, including, elected officials, state lawmakers. And a lot of them had to go back and correct themselves.
Yeah, and just a thumbnail process. Everyone is saying, well, there were 14 million people who voted in the Democratic primary for Joe Biden. Kinda. Joe Biden was on the ballot, but what they were voting for, and this is the same thing that happened in the Republican caucuses, people were voting for delegates to represent them at the national convention, because remember, we are a constitutional republic, not a democracy. But they were voting for delegates to represent them at the national convention. If they voted for Joe Biden, they were voting for delegates who were committed to supporting Joe Biden. But now that Joe Biden's out, they didn't have anywhere to go. So, it's really a bad faith or a misunderstanding of the process for people to say that. Okay, we had a lot of stuff happening. Speaking of elections, we had the election results finalized this week, the statewide canvass, and really all the results are holding, although Phil Lyman is going to contest the results. On what grounds, I don't know. Late last week, he struck out in court in his effort to gain access to the signature packets that Spencer Cox submitted in order to get on the ballot. I had reports that he was at a Pioneer Day. His supporters were at a Pioneer Day parade this week, passing out material, basically casting doubt on these signatures. We'll see how that plays out, but he's got a number of days. Colby Jenkins sued to get ballots with late postmarks counted. That was thrown out of court. That also is not going to happen. And so it's fascinating that the primary election is mostly behind us, but we have someone with fairly legitimate concerns about the postmarks, who really can't do anything about it. And then another person who's making bad faith arguments about how their opponent qualified for the ballot, and they aren't able to let it go. Just when I thought that we could move on to looking at the general election, we're still here, kinda.
Right. And I mean, if you're one of the people who follows Phil Lyman on social media, that's all he's posted about for months, right? Is about the election and questioning the integrity of it. And I'm interested to see, when we get financial disclosures, how much money he's spent after the primary election trying to contest these results.
Well, one of the things that he has done is he has formed a 501c4 nonprofit, and I heard him on a Zoom call with a far-right group, Utah Citizens for the Constitution, where he said that that's going to be able to hide who's giving money to him, which
is not correct.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Phil, for giving away the game there.
Right. And it's also not entirely correct, right? He still has to file 527s with the IRS.
Yeah, it's just when we find out, we'll be delayed down the road. Let's talk a little bit about Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill. He had, probably an ill-advised post criticizing Trump on social media where he said that even a dead body would do a better job or do less harm to America than Donald Trump. And this came right after the assassination attempt on the former president. Probably not the best timing for that kind of language. And when I talked to Sim Gill, he said, he probably could have chosen other words, but he stood by his point. This has enraged Republicans who have had a target on his back for a long time. And now they're making noise about using a bill they just passed in this last session, Senate Bill 273, which allows the governor to ask the Utah Supreme Court to report a replacement. They've been saying that, it's two different issues. And this bill said that if the Salt Lake County District Attorney, and this bill only targets him, is not prosecuting crime enough, well, then the governor can recommend to the Supreme Court. And they're saying this is just the latest incident that shows why he needs to be replaced. And you have a number of Republicans on the Hill on the warpath against him.
Yeah, and this is an ongoing feud between the legislature and Sim Gill, right? I mean, they have often publicly disagreed on different things, whether that's legislative policy, where he has challenged some of the laws they've passed, or even, where he's commented on their actions, individual lawmakers' actions potentially being unlawful. And so, there's a lot more to this story than just that one post. And I think, also that post, people need to look at it in context of when he made it. It was before President Biden stepped down, and a lot of people were questioning his competency. So, I mean, there's more to the story than just reading that tweet and what happened to President Trump last week when there was the assassination attempt.
And you'll note the lawmakers who are making the most noise about getting rid of Sim Gill live outside of Salt Lake County and represent people outside of the state's largest county. But do not be surprised if this continues to pick up steam as lawmakers are trying to figure out a way to get rid of him. But that would be up to the Supreme Court, because the governor can only make a recommendation in that. Another big story that sort of gone sort of flown onto the radar with all the other craziness that has happened this week is the state is asking a court to dismiss the lawsuit from the Utah Education Association over the vouchers program, the Utah Fits All Scholarship, but it's really a vouchers program that's going to spend $82 million of money that could go to public education to allow people to send their kids to private schools or homeschool them or whatever. It's about $8,000 per student, and the state is asking the court to throw out this lawsuit. No matter what happens, this has really opened up a rift between lawmakers and the Utah Education Association, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out.
Right. And even this last session, we saw some bills essentially in retaliation for things the UEA has said about the voucher program, where, the UEA has a lot of members among educators in the state. And the legislative leaders gave themselves essentially the same ability to contact teachers as the UEA. Mm-hmm. So we'll see what kind of messaging comes out around some of these actions from legislative leaders. But I'm not entirely surprised that this is the first move the state makes. This is usually what they do in most lawsuits. There's other ongoing lawsuits against the state in which the state has moved to have them dismissed.
That's an important point. Thank you for bringing that up, that the first thing you do is you ask to dismiss that this has no merit. And we'll see how that plays out. Right.
And, a lot of times it's not successful. And if it is, then it's challenged up to a higher court. So, you saw that even just a portion of the redistricting lawsuit was dismissed, and the Supreme Court said that shouldn't have been dismissed. So we'll see what happens. This is probably going to go on for a long time.
Utah was named the host for the 2034 Winter Games. That's 10 years from now. Everybody was celebrating, but we were the only city who wanted it. There's no other city bidding for it, so it was sort of a fait accompli. It wasn't as big as when they were awarded the 2002 games, a quarter of a century ago or more. So it wasn't that big of a deal. Everyone knew that this was coming, but it still generated a lot of excitement. It'll be fascinating to see now the state. We've got a lot of the infrastructure in place that we did not have prior to 2002, but there's still a lot of things that the state is going to have to do, and it'll be interesting to see how the legislature addresses that going forward. But we've got 10 years to go, and this is a feather in the cap for the state, saying, we had a really successful games, and the world is coming back, assuming that we still have snow. We obviously have the climate change, and we've had the 2 hottest days on record for the entire globe just this last week. So, still a touchy situation there.
Well, and I think it's interesting, where you have Salt Lake City is the one that was named the host, not just the state of Utah, although you have lawmakers arguing it should have been the state of Utah because, some of the events will take place in other counties. But Salt Lake City is often characterized as one of the most progressive cities in the country, whereas, Utah's a very red state. And so I think, it'll be interesting to see how, as we're planning around this and as the state likely has to fund a lot of this, what kinds of conversations might be had there, especially when it comes to public transportation, when it comes to, some of the things that the IOC is looking for in host cities as far as preventing climate change and
there's also the issue of the state's ban on the state's transgender bathroom ban that could cause some backlash. There are some social issues that surround the games that may come into play as we get ready to bring the world back to the state. And obviously people argue that it should have been that Utah is the host, but they're holding the surfing competition for these Olympics coming up in Tahiti, which is on the other side of the world from France. So I don't really think that's as big of a deal as people are making it. Last thing, and it's unfortunate, but it's also kind of funny. Senator Mike Lee gets pulled in by a hoax that Jimmy Carter had died. And if he had just taken 3 seconds to read this letter on faked letterhead announcing the death of the president, who is still alive as we are recording this, he would have known that it was a hoax when they were taught when they had a quote from the president from the funeral of his wife Rosalind last year. He called her a baddie. No. If you, I mean, this is incredible. It was immediately taken down, but really an embarrassment for Mike Lee, who is constantly posting on Twitter and also has a part-time job in the U.S. Senate. And
just the irony there is that lately he's used his X account just to criticize local media and the way they do their jobs endlessly. It shows really kind of a lack of media literacy there from the senator. And, he's also been advocating and seemingly looking for someone or finding someone to help start a conservative media outlet here. And so, what we would see from that really comes into question when you have him posting things like this.
And there's the point that you brought up about media literacy. He's harping on the local media being inaccurate, being biased, while posting things from Jack Posobiec and the Gateway. Well, it's not so much the Gateway Pundit, but the Post Millennial. A lot of really questionable news sites. I've been tracking this for a while. Just in the past 2 weeks, Mike Lee has posted more than 2,500 times on Twitter X, which is an average of 84 times a day. I know 11-year-olds who are social media. They love being on social media, and they don't post 84 times a day. So this is really it's interesting to watch the evolution of constitutional scholar Mike Lee into full-time content creator now.
Right, and honestly, it's almost like he does it to both raise his popularity outside of Utah, but also to make it hard to keep up with his messaging. He spews all sorts of things in all sorts of directions on the platform. And a lot of times it borders on conspiracy theory, like what he said about Vice President Harris, and essentially that it has been a long-term plan for her to be on the ballot as the presidential nominee.
Yeah, it's working. I mean, he's got quite a fefew followers. He's a very popular follow. So
Elon Musk engages with him almost weekly.
Yeah. It's working for him, and I guess more power to him. But I just wonder how much he looks at his colleague Ted Cruz and how much popularity he's getting from his podcast, and he just sees that this is an outlet where he can get his message out. But it's just not a good look for him to fall for this hoax, and he's done that a number of times. If you go back and look at the at a number of stories that we've written about that. Okay, well that's not everything that's happened, but those are the important things that happened in the last week. You have anything on the horizon that you're working on?
Digging into looks at I'm writing about ways that the legislature is looking at changing sexual assault laws here, and how there are disagreements between Democrats and Republicans on how to do that, and what we might see from Republicans there. And also looking at mail-in voting in the state. We've seen a lot of state elected officials here question whether we should keep mail-in voting or whether we should make it opt-in, and looking at just how many people are using mail-in voting and who might be disenfranchised if we take that away. There's a number of things, but those are the most immediate things that I'm looking at.
Looking forward to that reporting. Emily Anderson Stern, find her online, read her stuff. She does a tremendous job. Coming up next on the podcast, we're going to talk with former State Senator Scott Howell about his longtime friendship with Joe Biden. Stay tuned for that. This is This Week in Utah Politics. Joining me now on This Week in Utah Politics is former Utah State Senator, Utah Senate Minority Leader Scott Howell. He also ran for governor. He's run for U.S. Senate a couple of times. And I wanted to talk to him about the news that President Joe Biden is not running for another term. He made the decision to step aside. You have known President Biden for a long time. You've worked with him. You've worked with his sister. Scott, thanks for joining the program. And let's get your thoughts, or let's get your thoughts of this decision, and tell us what you can about what you know about how this situation came about, or this decision came about.
Well, first of all, thank you, Brian, and I'm thrilled that you're back on podcast. We missed you, And these last 2 weekends have been harrowing for me. I owe these bags underneath my eyes to the situation of what has been happening. Essentially, I think everyone knew that President Biden had some serious decisions to make with regards to the campaign. And actually, a week before that, the president was back at his beach home in Delaware, and his family was all coming in on Saturday, and they were supposed to have this very heart-to-heart conversation. And then he got the call about the assassination attempt, did a staged White House scene, and came out and talked to the country, and jumped on Air Force One, flew back to D.C., met with his cabinet where they tried to figure out what was going on, how big a threat was this. You heard about the Iranian thing and all those things that were going on. Went to bed late that night. Next morning, the campaign had a meeting with him. They said, we don't know what to think. We don't know if we're going to lose on empathy and a sympathy vote to that very important 7 states undecided voters. And then he came out Sunday night with a statement, went out to Vegas, was doing the rope line, got COVID, and he got really sick. I mean, he was sick. It wasn't anything that he could go on national television and talk about what was going on. So the following Saturday, Mike Donnellan and some of his closest advisors got together, and they had a heart-to-heart crucial conversation. The president did just exactly what he always does. He puts the country first, and he made a decision to give up all that power. Now, he didn't make it until he slept on it Saturday night. Sunday morning, he called his campaign staff, his closest advisors, his very closest advisor, and said, I made this decision. And then he called the VP, and he released a letter. And people have made such conspiracy theories about this letter. The reason he didn't come out on national broadcast is because his voice, and I heard him on Monday afternoon when he was talking to Jen O'Malley. She's been his closest advisor for a long, long time. She's running the campaign, and his voice was quivering. I mean, I've had COVID to that point where you get that sick. And so that's why he wrote a letter, and he said it's time that I hang it up, and I'm going to finish out my last few months strong, and I can dedicate all my energy and all my time. The thing that was most interesting to me was to how people reacted. A lot of them said, oh, this is the worst day for Joe Biden. No. The worst day for Joe Biden was when his wife and daughter were killed tragically, and then when his son, Beau, died of a brain tumor. And that's how centered he is. He knows what's important in life. And I got to tell you, Brian, I really respect him. I've known Valerie Biden-Owens for a long time. We've gotten to know Gill. And this is a family who genuinely puts the country first. And so to give up that much power, that just shows the courage and the dedication of the president to do the right things. And by the way,
what was your initial reaction when you heard the news that the president was not going to be running for another term? Take me through that moment and what it was like for you to hear that and start processing that news.
So I was sitting in church, and all of a sudden I started getting these texts, and I try and turn it off so I can have a little reprieve. But they just kept mounting, and then I got a call, and then it was out there in the news. My first reaction was gratitude that the president made that decision to give up that power, and he deserved it. There were so many times I saw him walking up Air Force One steps, and I wanted to go up, put my arms around him and say, Joe, let me help you. Let me help you up those stairs. Joe, you don't have to go out and do these rope lines. And it really was of gratitude. And people asked me, I was interviewed more times about should he resign or should he not? And my answer was always the same. That is the decision of the President of the United States of America. Only he can answer this. I put this caveat on it, and I said, Joe, if you can truly beat Donald J. Trump, then run. But if you can't, face the reality. And he did. He faced the reality. I think those polls started to go down, and he continued to make some major gaffes, in my opinion. And I hated the way that the Republican Party treated him. I hated the way that they mocked him and they diminished and ridiculed. But that's pretty much the DJT way of doing things. But it was still hurtful to me. It's like having a family member, and you don't want them to get picked on. Yeah, they made gaffes and they made mistakes. They didn't speak right, and I get that. But I think deep inside, Brian, I wanted him to do the right thing for he and his family. Now he can go finish out a strong term, a really strong term. He can give it all he can and will, and he and Gill can have the reprievement that they deserve. They deserve to go out with a great legacy. The other thing that I kept thinking about is I don't want Joe to go out with all the service he's given to our country for the last 50 years by losing to the former president.
What do you make of these arguments? And they're mostly coming from Republicans, and I consider them mostly bad faith arguments, that if the president is cannot run again, cannot run for another term, then he should not remain as the president. And there's no law that says the president has to run for re-election. There's the two are not mutually exclusive. So I'm curious what you make of these arguments, because I take them for what they are, and they to me just seem like bad faith concern trolling.
Well, I think you phrased it just perfect, Brian. Bad faith trolling, comments that gain. They're part of the red meat program to get people to think about that. But I will tell you that I'm absolutely disappointed in our senior senator. When he calls to invoke the 25th Amendment, it makes me question whether he really understands the Constitution. To invoke the 25th Amendment, it has to start with the vice president, and then it goes to all the cabinet members. And the way they phrase that, it's like, oh, we in the Congress, we in the Senate can just go invoke that. And so it questions really how much our senior senator really understands the Constitution.
And I look at those arguments, and all I have to say is he played a major role in trying to keep the President Trump in power after he won an election, an extra legal attempt, and only bailed out at the last second. So, he can miss me with those kind of arguments because they're not serious arguments, and he knows better.
I couldn't have. He does know better. And I wish he would step up to the plate and do the right things, because it's just so much red meat out there. It just gets worse. It invokes this whole conspiracy things that, well, he can't govern the country. He can't, and he'll do a better job than having to go out and hit rope lines, flying clear across the country. And, that's demanding on someone. Now he can concentrate every day, go down to his office and figure out the Palestinian, the Gaza initiative. He can take really bold steps on climate, and he can make a lot of progress with what the things that he's talked about. It wouldn't surprise me if he comes out with another big border initiative, and makes that an issue of trying to get people to come to reasonable thought on what we could do together. So I'm thrilled that he can go be the president of the United States. He doesn't have those strings attached, and that he can be our president.
Now, you've had a number of interactions with Vice President Kamala Harris, who is now the presumptive Democratic nominee. She secured enough support from delegates to win that. Tell me about, and you've told me this story before, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. Tell me about when she was here prior to the vice presidential debate in 2020, when she was getting prepared for that, she arrived in Salt Lake City. You took her around. Just tell that story, because I think it is absolutely fascinating, and it's sort of an interesting peek into your interactions with.
Well, thanks, Brian. It was a fascinating experience because I really didn't know her. We were living in California at the time she was the AG, so I got to know her through the policies and initiatives that she was putting into place. And contrary to popular misconceptions out there, she was very tough on crime. In fact, she had some very left-wing groups in California that didn't like her because she was prosecuting pretty hard on drugs. So I didn't know her. I got a call. They said, hey, can you help us find a place for the VP, for the VP candidate to stay? And that in and of itself was an experience working with the Secret Service, going out to these different houses. I asked some of my closest friends, if you can believe this, it's very gutty. I called them and I said, look, could you vacate your house for a week and make it available? But I can't tell you for what. I can't tell you when, but can you do that? And I'll tell you.
People have a pretty good idea if you're asking them about that. I mean, you can't say it, but, right?
It was really fascinating because these people opened up their hearts. They opened up their house. Some of them even cleaned out their closets before. And this is the protocol. The Secret Service comes. And I'll never forget at one house we went to, I thought it was perfect. It was up on the side of the mountain. It was on the north side of Salt Lake, northeast, and I thought it was great. And I'll never forget the Secret Service says to me, and this is the irony of what's happened today, he said, oh, the line of sight from that house next door makes it too vulnerable. And I thought, what do you mean the line of sight? And he said, well, we'd have to take over that house, and all of this. So we kept looking, and we finally found a place down at City Creek at the very top, a penthouse, and we got that all settled. And, she stayed there, and then they set up a stage over at the Marriott, the Marriott right there across from South Temple. And they set up a stage, and every day she took the elevator down, walked underneath City Creek, and went to the Marriott and practiced. So when we kind of got to know each other, I met her, and it was just kind of small talk. I got a call, and they said, Scott, where would you think would be a good place to take the vice president? I said, look, there's so many places, Great Salt Lake. I mean, there's just so many places you can go. And they said, well, what about This Is the Place Monument? And I said, yeah, that's a great choice. And lo and behold, she had read about this place where Brigham Young and the pioneers had come down into the valley. And so I said, that's great. And they said, okay, meet us up there at this time. And so Linda and I drove up, and we were waiting for her. She jumped out of the car. We had some small talk, and then she said, I just want to talk to you. And she said, tell me about this place. And so I told her the stories and all the things that happened. And then she said, let's go. We went to every monument up there, every single monument. And she stopped and she read those monuments. She read the plaques. And about the third one, she said, have you ever read these plaques? And I said, well, I've kind of glazed over them. I really haven't read them. She said, well, you should read them, because this is a fascinating history of the state of Utah. And the thing that impressed me so much is that she took the time, and there's one up there about a midwife woman who delivered, I can't remember, hundreds of babies on the trek. And she was mesmerized with that and this woman and the care that she'd given. And when we got done, I think this was just really shows how sincere and how wonderful of a person she is. She turned to me and she said, well, all of you here in this valley really are kind of immigrants. You got thrown out of a place and you had to move. And she said, my parents were immigrants here. And I said, we have a lot in common on the challenges of religious freedom. And we talked about other things. And Brian, I'm not kidding you. She is a steel trap for data, facts, and figures. And I think she has a historical perspective. And we talked about that for another 15 or 20 minutes. And really, she was fascinated at this monument and what had happened in the valley. So that really, in and of itself, made us very close, and it was great. I saw her it's been 3 weeks now up at Park City, and we talked about that, and she said, "I will never forget that experience, Scott, and thank you so much for taking the time to go on that."
And you told me that you had to wave her off of a visit to Temple Square as well, right?
She wanted to go to the famous conference center of the LDS Church so bad. And that weekend just happened to be conference weekend. So I made a call over to my contacts at the church, and they really do have this so planned out that they have meetings almost the timeline is incredible what they do. And they said, "Scott, we just can't fit it in." And I remember she was just a candidate at that time. So I went back to her and I said, "Kamala, we have church meetings beginning Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, and then we have one on Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon." And she turned to me and she said, "Wow, you guys go to church a lot." And I said, "No, time out. We do this twice a year. This is where we bring in, we have a worldwide conference." And she said, "Oh, good, because I thought maybe you guys were going to church all weekend." And she kind of made a joke, but this is how her determination and her character. I got a call and they said, "Look, Kamala wants to go over to Temple Square. What do you think?" And I said, "It would be great. Just don't say anything to anybody. Just take the service." And she had about, 3 or 4 people with her, and then the Secret Service. They went over, they went to the Beehive House, they went to the whole thing, they walked through, and they did it early in the morning. I think they thought that way they would avoid any of the, all the people that were attending conference. Then she did something remarkable. She walked up State Street and went to the Capitol, and she again read all the monuments. She stopped and she read each one of them. And there was one up there that really she appreciated, and it was Chief Joseph, and talking about the historical of the Native Americans here and how they work together. And that really caught her attention. And she was very appreciative of it. She walked around the Capitol, and then they walked back. They walked back to her where she was staying in residence. So she knows Utah very well. She likes it out here, and
you think that she's going to come back before the election in November? Now, obviously, you can't definitively say, but do you think that that's a possibility? Because usually when you get a Democratic candidate coming through here, it's most often just for a fundraiser, like in Park City. I think the last one we had who really did a campaign stop was Bernie Sanders in 2016, and that was a remarkable event up at This Is the Place State Park. But do you think that that's a possibility?
Well, Brian, that's a great question. What I think and what I'm hoping is yesterday, former President Trump made a statement that I hope he's going to commit to. He said, "I will debate. I'll do many debates. I'll debate anytime with the Vice President anywhere." In my mind, since the Commission on Presidential Debates were planning on a debate September 10th up at the University of Utah, and now they've been flushed away. I mean, they're no longer in the picture. I can't see why some influencers and individuals in our state, i.e. the governor and Jason Perry and others, why we can't get together and say, "Look, we have a venue. We have the security. We've started on the infrastructure. Will you come to Utah and debate on September 10th? Have a presidential..."
That's an interesting idea. We'll have to see if that comes together. Last thing I want to ask you, we are recording this on Wednesday morning. The state, Salt Lake City, has just been awarded as the host city for the 2034 Winter Olympics. You were in the legislature the last time that Salt Lake City was named the host, and you were there for all the planning and the ramp up and the games itself. Give me your reaction on the world coming back to Salt Lake City for the Winter Games. What is it, in 10 years' time now?
My reaction is, first of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity that I had to serve on the Olympic Committee. I know that thrill of when the IOC president stands up and says, and this is back many years ago when we won the bid, he said, "We give the bid to the city of Salt Lake City." And we all were pausing that moment when he said, "To the city of," we're thinking, oh, we lost. Mike Levitt jumped up out of his chair up on the table. It was that feeling of euphoria. I can appreciate that with the governor and all the people that are back there with him, the mayor. And it was overwhelming. And I remember we all took a moment to think about things, and we wrote on a blanket. And this blanket is an Olympic blanket that's out at the Market Street Grill in Holiday, Utah. And I wrote these words. In 1837, the Mormon pioneers came to Utah. In 2002, the world will come to Utah. And what I meant by that is we opened up the kimono to show the world that we have the skills, we have the talent, we have the language skills to welcome the world. And for me, participating in all of those events was spectacular. That year, I passed a bill 3 years earlier. And that bill said that whoever bought a license plate for the Olympics, because we had an Olympic license plate,
that a
percentage of that went to the underserved students. And we built a fund of, I can't remember. I think it was a couple $1 million. And we were passing out passes for kids, elementary to high school, mostly in Title I schools, to attend the events. And I had someone bring that to my attention the other day. I'd forgotten about it. And they said, our whole school got to go see a hockey game, and they would have never been able to do it. So when my service in the legislature came full circle, when I was able to help citizens here, and I'm ecstatic. I knew they were going to win. I mean, I know Fraser Bullock well enough that he wouldn't be taking the whole group over there. So I think for us to host the world again, it really is a wonderful thing for the citizens of the state of Utah.
Scott Howell, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. And I'm sure we will be talking as the campaign rolls into the final, 15 weeks now until Election Day. I mean, we're just about 100 days to go. It's going to be here before we know it. Scott Howell, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for your time, Brian. I'm glad we're back doing podcasts. We've always enjoyed listening to you. So thank you.
Well, reserve your kudos until we get through a few episodes and see if this one's going to work. And let's end today's episode with this. Just 1 week ago, Utah Governor Spencer Cox flip-flopped and endorsed former President Donald Trump in his re-election campaign because he said he believed Trump was a changed man following the attempted assassination at one of his political rallies.
My commitment to him was that I would help him try to lower the temperature in this country. And I sincerely hope that from what I've heard from people around him, that he is committed to this, that, again, this is something that hasn't been high on his list in the past. I think that's probably an understatement. And so I'll work closely with him to help do that.
It didn't take long for Trump to return to the gutter. Here he was on Fox News just 1 week after Cox's endorsement.
Well, Kamala Harris has given two speeches now that she's the candidate, and they're almost identical speeches. This is what she's doing. She's going after you this way. Watch.
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type. And in this campaign, I promise you, I will proudly put my record against his any day of the week.
There's the attack. What's the retort?
Well, I think it's disgusting, and I get a kick out of one thing. They say, sir, be nice. You just got hit with a bullet. Maybe he's changed. Be nice. And I'd love to be nice, but I'm dealing against real garbage. She's bad news. She's a radical left, not very smart person.
Mr. President,
she failed her bar exam. She couldn't even pass her bar exam.
That's probably not what Cox had in mind when he launched his Disagree Better campaign. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of This Week in Utah Politics. If you haven't yet, smash that like and subscribe button. Also, remember to leave us a rating and review. It really helps new people find the show. This Week in Utah Politics is written and produced by me, Brian Schott, in cooperation with the Salt Lake Tribune. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back next week.